Our form is certainly working great, but of course there's one important thing missing: validation. We can always submit the form. We don't get any validation errors. We don't see if the form is valid or not. Now, whilst a framework like Angular has a built-in validation package basically, React hasn't. You have to do validation on your own. There are some third-party packages you might want to check out, but in general, you can also build validation on your own. And I want to build it on my own. Now, the goal is that whenever we change the value, so here in the input changed handler, we also check if it's valid or not. And of course, the validity of an element should be defined by some rules which we set up in the order form. So here for a given input, where we also define the type and the config, so basically the HTML attributes and the value, we also might have some validation key where we set up rules we want to have respected. This could be a rule like required should be set to true, so that this is a field which is absolutely required, that it must not be empty. This is a very often used rule, of course. So let's use that. Let's add this validation field with just required to all our elements right after the value, so on the top element level, therefore, so that it must not be empty. And I don't need it for the dropdown because I have to select the value there anyways. So now I added validation to most of my elements, except for the dropdown for the reason I just mentioned. Now, how do we check this? For this, I'll create another new method, which I'll name check validation, or validity maybe. Validity, where I get the value and then the rules. And then this should return true or false, determining whether this is valid or not. This also means that I have to have some valid property on each element in my state which I can manage. So that I have like valid, which is false initially, let's say. So I'll also add this to all elements which should have validation. And of course you could also kind of add this as a subkey of validation or something like that. So I'll add valid here. Set it to false initially maybe. And now in check validity, I want to return true or false to then in input changed handler adjust this valid property too. Now here, of course, it depends on which rules we have. I will simply check if rules has a required rule. So if that is truish, then I want to adjust some is valid variable, which initially is false as a default maybe. I want to set is valid equal to the value comparison. So is a valid should be equal if it's not equal to an empty string. However, I want to use value trim here to remove any white spaces at the beginning or end. So now is valid is updated to true or false depending on the check if the trimmed value is unequal to an empty string. If it is not equal, is valid will be true. And at the end of check validity, I will return is valid, so true or false. In the input changed handler, I can then of course also update my valid value of the updated form element. Here I want to set updated form element valid equal to this check validity and pass the updated form element value, which we already adjusted to the value passed by the event. And of course, I want to pass my updated form element validation object, which is just my rules. So validation here has, for example, a required property, and that is what I check for in check validity. I see if my rules object has a required property and if the value of that property is truish or is treated as true. So now with that set up, we should be able to check for that and set valid to true or false. Because keep in mind that this check validity returns true or false. So we store the result of this check in the valid property. Now to see if this really works, I'll simply console log my updated form element here for now, so that we can see on every keystroke if this changes. So if I enter something into my name, this is the object, and you see valid is true. If I remove the t, you see valid is false because now it's empty. If I enter a couple of white spaces here, then you see valid still is false because we're trimming the value. So our custom required check is working fine here. And now, of course, we could add more rules. We could add another check here where we say if rules min length, if we have something like this, then we can set is valid equal to value length greater equal rules min length. So now min length, of course, would be expected to be like a value like 1 or 2 or 3, which also will resolve to true, so which will activate this rule. And you can, of course, be creative and even create more complex rules which might have objects as a value, where you can access rules min length and then something like absolute minimum or something like that. So you can really be creative here and create your own rules dynamically. I'll use the min length rule here for the zip code. Let's say the zip code should receive a min length of 5 and let's say also a max length of 5. And now that means I will also add a check for the max length here. If rules max length, and here this should be then smaller or equal to max length. And our current validation logic here has a crucial flaw, by the way. I'll come back to that in a second. So to see if this length validation now also works by just adding checks here and adding it in our setup here for the zip code. To see if that works, let's go back to the application. Let's enter something into the zip code, like 555. Let's expand this, and you see valid is true. So it's not working here, unfortunately. The reason for this is our flaw. If we have a look at our validation method, we check one rule after the other. That means that, of course, only the last rule has to be satisfied to turn is valid to true. Even if min length sets is valid to false, if max length is met thereafter, which it currently is, this will be set to true again. That has the result that if I add 6 digits here, which would be too long, that now it is indeed not valid anymore because the last check, max length, resolves to false for this long of an input. So this is the issue, the flaw we have right now. We are checking the rules one after another. Let's fix this flaw in the next lecture.